Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar, Supporting the Whole Student Through Policy and Practice, that is co-sponsored by Transforming Education. I am Bob LaRocca. I'm Director of Policy and Communications at Transform Ed. And before I run through our agenda and introduce our panel, I'd like to make a quick comment about technology. This will be recorded and we will send out the link to all participants after today's session. Also, subject to time, we will try to take your questions today, and you can submit those through the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout the session. We will do our best to get to them at the end of the panel discussion today. As for our agenda, I'd like to introduce everybody who's participating in this webinar. As I said, I'm Bob LaRocca, Director of Policy and Communications here at Transform Ed. We're joined by Melissa Meller, a Communication Strategist for the Aspen Institute's National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. We also are joined by Nicole Key Frick-Pothier, Program Administrator for the Elementary School Behavior Action Team at San Francisco Unified School District. And we are also joined by Susan Ward-Roncalli, Social Emotional Learning Wellness Facilitator for LA Unified School District. I'm going to start us off by talking about SEL, or Social Emotional Learning Measurement, and some of the research behind this, as well as the work of the core districts. I'll then hand it over to Melissa, who will provide some information and updates about the National Commission's work on social, emotional, and academic development. And then we'll hand it over to Nicole and Key, who will briefly introduce the SEL work that's going on in their districts before we have a panel discussion among the four of us that will be moderated by Melissa. The goal of today's webinar is to highlight some of the great work being done by the Aspen Institute, by the core districts, by us at Transform Ed, but we really are here today to specifically hear from the practitioners on the local level who are really making great change in the classroom. So let me start by providing some background on our organization. Transform Ed is a nonprofit. We're based in Boston, but we work nationally. And we support school systems in assessing and developing students' social emotional skills. We do this by bridging the gap between the world of education, psychology, and neuroscience research with the world of education policy and practice. We work closely with school systems that want to act on this research now to better serve students more effectively. And so, for example, we served as the strategic advisor to the core districts in California, which I will talk about more in a moment, helping them to roll out their unique accountability system that includes social emotional competencies. We work with an amazing set of researchers around the country, and the broad range of perspectives that this group offers is really crucial to the work that we do, because it enables us to look across multiple disciplines and to identify findings from many different researchers. Most importantly, we use those findings to translate them into practical guidance for education systems. We often joke that this field is like the Tower of Babel, because we know that there's a lot of different terms that are used to describe social emotional learning. We use the acronym MESH, which stands for Mindsets, Essential Skills, and Habits. And we do that because we want to highlight the fact that we believe that social emotional learning is more than just skills. It does include mindsets and habits as well. That said, I will use terms like social emotional skills or social emotional competencies interchangeably with MESH throughout this presentation. As I said in my first slide on Transform Ed, we are an organization that is really guided by research, and the research base on MESH is really compelling. We consistently see that these skills impact students' academic, career, and well-being outcomes. So for example, with respect to academics, teaching students learning mindsets has been shown to improve GPA and academic performance in such areas as math and English. With respect to careers, we've seen that stronger social emotional competencies predict greater likelihood of being employed. And finally, with respect to lifelong well-being, individuals with stronger MESH or strong MESH are less likely to struggle with obesity, smoking, substance abuse, and other mental health issues. As you can see from this slide, there's a lot here that I could say but can't cover. But all of it is summarized in a recent paper that we've written called Ready to Be Counted. And this is available for download for free on our website. You have the URL there. Please go to it if you're curious more about the research behind these skills. So what is it that we know? Well, one thing we know is that from national survey data, 88% of educators say that their school is already implementing some sort of program or practice to build students' mesh. Up here in front of you in this slide is a quick snapshot of the many different approaches that schools are taking here. Of course, the categories that we've got are not 100% distinct. There certainly are overlaps among what some programs are doing. But the point is that some schools are using discrete interventions. So the category in the upper left corner there, such as PERTS at Stanford, which offers online resources and strategies to promote growth mindset. Some schools are using behavior tracking systems like PBIS, which focus on setting explicit expectations and reinforcing positive behavior. There are teacher PD programs that focus on explicit instruction. So an example of this is the Greater Good Science Center in Berkeley, California, which offers online professional development. They've put out a publication for teachers. They've got a summer institute on mindfulness for educators as well. And there are comprehensive programs that offer curriculum around supporting social emotional learning, such as Second Step, Paths, Ruler, so on and so forth. These programs typically include curriculum for explicit instruction of mesh skills, along with resources for integrating mesh into academic classes. There's a PD component usually, and there's often also a school-wide community building component too. We also know that as a nation, we're putting significant resources towards mesh. Schools are spending about $650 million a year on mesh-related curricula and instructional strategies. And teachers tell us that they're spending on average more than 4 hours a week on activities intended to build students' mesh. If we include the total cost of that teacher time that I'm talking about, we get to a figure of about $30 billion a year that we're spending related to social emotional learning. More information about this will be available in a forthcoming paper that we're working on here at Transform Ed and plan to release later this winter. So this brings us to the question of why measure mesh? Well, while there are many great approaches, as I showed in the previous slide there, all those different great programs, the field has yet to come to a consensus about which practices work best or how to use a combination of those practices. In particular, two different studies in recent years of school-wide intervention programs produced strikingly different results on this. So one is a meta-analysis that was released by Castle, and I've got a quote from that released study on the left there. This was released in 2011, and it found that participation in SEL programs did produce gains in achievement among students. However, a study released by IES in 2010 found that there were no differences in student performances between those that participated in SEL programs and those who did not. So the takeaway here is that there are a lot of programs and there's a lot of resources being put towards these efforts. But we still have a lot to learn about which approaches build student skills effectively and which do not. And so measurement can be a key ingredient in trying to figure out how we can effectively direct resources to students and in a way that can move the needle on social emotional learning. A group of districts that have begun to measure these skills and mindsets are the core districts in California. They are a group of 8 districts in California that serve over 1 million students across about 1,600 schools. CORE is the organization that fosters collaboration, innovation, and the sharing of best practices among the districts. And those participating districts include, as you can see here, Oakland, Long Beach, Sacramento, Fresno, Santa Ana, also Los Angeles and San Francisco, who we will hear from later on in the session. The core districts have been working together collaboratively since 2010, but in 2013, superintendents from 6 of these districts joined together to create a new definition of school quality and student success, and one that in particular looked at students as whole people rather than just as standardized test scores. These 6 districts eventually created a multimetric data system, as you can see from the diagram on the slide here, that includes academic outcomes, which counted for 60% of the index, and that's the gray part of the diagram on the left side, as well as social, emotional, and school climate and culture data, which is 40% of the index on the right side in green. What's really important here to note is that these changes were led by superintendents and by stakeholders at the district level. These folks believed that a more holistic set of factors were important, but they also wanted to focus on building capacity for schools and for their systems, and not just using or not using the results for any kind of harshly punitive purposes. So if we take a look at the social, emotional, and cultural climate bucket on the right side of the diagram in green, we can see that CORE collected a bunch of different data. And some of that data was data that they were already collecting, such as chronic absenteeism, suspension and expulsion rates, as well as culture and climate data. But the measuring of social emotional skills was something that was new. That was a new development, and it accounted for about 8% of the overall score. One other thing to note is that CORE is constantly trying to approach this work through a lens of equity. So they continue to break down, they have broken down the data by subgroup to identify and address any instances of disparity and disproportionality. In partnership with Transform Ed and along with input from across participating districts, CORE prioritized 4 specific mesh competencies for inclusion within their system. As you can see here, the 4 competencies that they prioritized were growth mindset, which is the belief that your abilities can grow over time with effort. The second is self-efficacy, the belief in your ability to succeed at reaching a particular goal. In this case, we're talking about an academic goal. Self-management, the ability to regulate your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And lastly, social awareness, the ability to take the perspective of and empathize with those of different backgrounds. After CORE collaboratively and thoughtfully determined these competencies and that they wanted to measure them, they needed to figure out how exactly they were going to measure them. We provided some assistance here by speaking to experts in the field of social emotional assessment and provided some advice on good measures. But CORE ultimately decided to, CORE ultimately decided to use student self-reports and teacher reports of students. So here we have a chart that explains the background of how these two and where these 2 reports were used. And you can see that the interpersonal skills of self-management and social awareness were measured through teacher reports of students at the K through 4 level. But all 4 of the competencies were measured by student self-reports at the 5 through 12 level, as well as being measured through teacher reports for those 2 interpersonal skills of self-management and social awareness. Up here, you have in front of you a sample item of a prompt that would be asked of a student. This is on the self-management scale. So it says here, please answer how often you did the following during the last 30 days. And I'll leave it up here for a second so that you can take a closer look. But an example of one of the prompts would be, I came to class prepared. And students could answer that with almost never, once in a while, sometimes, often, or almost all the time. So CORE did not release these measures immediately. They piloted them first, and then the following year, they ran a field test of the measures, which was in 2015. And what they found was really encouraging. The self-reports were predictive of other student outcomes. So as you can see here, the results show that ratings on each measure, with each measure displayed through a different color on this bar chart. So for example, growth mindset being the darkest color on the left of each of the clusters. Each measure was correlated in a positive direction with academic outcomes, such as GPA and test scores. And it was also correlated in a negative direction with student behaviors, such as whether a student was suspended. So in other words, students who had stronger social emotional skills tended to have higher GPAs and test scores and lower incidence of being suspended or missing school. And importantly, as I mentioned before, that CORE is always trying to approach this work through a lens of equity. These correlations did hold across subgroups. So CORE is currently using both the academic data and the SEL data to drive change and improvement. Last August, CORE as a collaborative prioritized a few broad areas for improvement, and they ultimately decided to place a heavy emphasis on improving math scores for African American and Hispanic and Latino students in grades 4 through 8. During the design process of this, one of the potential drivers that surfaced from the district level on how to improve math scores was to integrate social emotional learning into math instruction. So this is an example of how CORE is using the data system to focus on issues of equity, that they're being guided by district level input from stakeholders, but also using research that tells us that enhancing social emotional skills can contribute to improving academic outcomes. In terms of next steps for CORE, they have applied for a research pilot waiver to continue using this system to inform decisions and drive change and improvement, as I mentioned. CORE is pursuing the research pilot through conversations with the California State Board of Education. And the goal is to include the CORE districts as a research pilot in California's state plan that they will be submitting to the Department of Education in the fall. And briefly, I think it's important to mention federal policy changes in this conversation, just given how important those changes have been. Last December, President Obama signed into law sweeping education legislation, which, as we know, is called ESSA, stands for Every Student Succeeds Act. And there are a few key features of that law that relate directly to SEL and MESH. One is that ESSA devolves more power to states and to local authorities, including districts and CMOs, providing them with the flexibility to expand the definition of student and school success. The second is that throughout the law, the law emphasizes the use of evidence-based approaches. And then thirdly, ESSA establishes the opportunity to incorporate SEL measures into state systems, either for accountability purposes, for formative purposes, so in other words, ways that schools can identify areas of needed support, or for other public reporting. And before I hand it over to Melissa, I've got up here not only my contact information, but if you are interested in signing up for our weekly newsletter that comes out on Wednesdays or Thursdays, or if you're interested in some of our professional development toolkits or any of our downloadable papers, please visit us at www.transformingeducation.org. All of these resources are free and they're easily accessible. Please follow us on Twitter at transforming_ed. And if you have any questions or comments about this section of the presentation, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is bob@transformingeducation.org. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to talk about the Aspen Institute's National Commission and the work that they're doing.
Thanks so much, Bob, and hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be participating in this webinar today. The National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development is in its beginning stages, which means we're very much in listening and learning mode right now. So hearing about the work that's currently underway is so helpful as we think through how to help schools support the comprehensive development of their students. I'll start with just a very brief overview of the National Commission before turning the floor over to Key and to Susan to hear more about the work that's happening in their districts. Next slide, please. The National Commission launched this past fall and includes 25 leaders from various sectors, including education, research, business, and policy. It's led by 3 co-chairs, Linda Darling-Hammond, head of the Learning Policy Institute and professor emeritus at Stanford University, Governor John Engler, president of the Business Roundtable and former governor of Michigan, and Tim Shriver, co-founder and chair of CASEL and chairman of the Special Olympics. The The Commission's driving purpose is to explore how to fully integrate social, emotional, and academic development, what we call SEAD, in K-12 education so that all of the nation's students are prepared to thrive in school, in career, and in life. As part of this broader goal, the Commission is hoping to galvanize a national conversation about the importance of SEAD and is working to align current SEAD efforts for maximum impact. In addition, the Commission is developing a roadmap of concrete action-oriented steps in research, practice, and policy to help build and sustain a K-12 education system that is focused on the whole student and that fully prepares our youth for the future. And I think it's worth noting that the Commission is housed at the Aspen Institute because of the Institute's reputation for sponsoring productive, nonpartisan dialogue that leads to meaningful action. And this is very much in keeping with the Commission's intent. Next slide. One of the unique aspects of the Commission is its deep commitment to hearing from multiple perspectives as it explores how to support the comprehensive development of the nation's students. And this commitment has truly shaped the Commission's organizing structure. The full Commission team, in addition to the 25-member Commission itself, also includes a Council of Distinguished Scientists, a Council of Distinguished Educators, a Youth Commission, a Parent Advisory Panel, a Funders Collaborative, and a Partners Collaborative. And all of these groups are lending their varied expertise and experiences to the Commission's work. So for example, the Science Council will ensure that the Commission's exploration and efforts are grounded in research, and one of its first goals is to more clearly define what SEAD is and what it looks like. Meanwhile, the Educator Council is ensuring that the Commission's efforts are grounded in what we know from practice, and one of its first tasks is to identify the barriers that have prevented more widespread implementation of SEAD. Again, all of these groups will play a very important role in shaping the Commission's work over the coming months. Next slide. In keeping with the Commission's commitment to listening and learning from these multiple voices, we conducted a social media campaign before the Commission's first meeting, which was held last fall. The campaign asked for thoughts on SEAD-related topics and issues that the Commission should keep in mind as it embarked on its work. We received a lot of helpful input through this campaign. A lot of it centered on 4 themes, which ranged from the need for explicit preparation to help educators implement SEAD at the classroom and school levels, to the importance of schools partnering with families and communities to more holistically support students. We shared all of this feedback with the full Commission team, and this is an example of the type of outreach and calls for input that we plan to engage in throughout the Commission's lifespan. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the Commission met for the first time this past fall, and it met alongside its 2 councils, the Youth Commission and the Partners and Funders Collaborative, as part of a deliberate effort to bridge perspectives and work at the intersection of research, practice, and policy. The meeting was incredibly productive and energizing, and I want to share just a few of the takeaways that came out of it that will shape the Commission's work to come. A theme that we heard again and again is that integrating SEAD requires the entire K-12 community. This work is not the responsibility of schools alone, and community engagement is essential to meaningful and lasting change. Also, efforts to integrate SEAD should be driven locally. Context matters. Local schools and districts are most able to determine the specific strategies that will work best in meeting their students' and communities' unique needs. Effectively implementing SEAD requires a change movement and a culture shift. By this, we mean it's not simply a program, an add-on, or another initiative. It really must be a systematic reorganization that includes teaching and learning, school climate and culture, school community partnerships, and more. We also know that educators already believe that SEAD is important. They don't need to be convinced of this, but they must be given the time, space, and support to effectively integrate and implement SEAD. And then finally, science tells us that learning happens in a social context and that relationships are essential to learning. So as such, a focus on SEAD matters for both supporting students academically and preparing them for college, careers, and life. I also want to add here that during their first meeting, the Commission heard from both a research panel and a practitioner panel, and some very valuable insights were shared during these panels. We recorded these sessions and they're available on the Commission website, so I encourage you to check them out if you have the opportunity. And that actually brings me to the final slide. Looking ahead, the Commission will meet virtually in February, and its next in-person meeting is in May. But in the meantime, I encourage you to stay connected with the Commission by visiting our website and following us on Twitter. And via our website, you can subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter. You can access materials and resources from the first Commission meeting. And we also have a variety of other SEAD resources available. We also encourage you to email us if you have any questions or comments. And with that, I want to thank you for the time to provide this brief update of the Commission's work, and I'll turn the floor over to Key to talk about the efforts that are happening in San Francisco.
Some years back, and then later on behavioral RTI, which was inclusive of PBIS and SEL curriculum for K-8, and the Good Behavior Game, which is really the PACS Good Behavior Game. So when the core waiver came along, what we did is that we looked at the strategies that we were already teaching and building capacity at our schools, and aligned those strategies with the 4 specific SEL competencies, because we felt that if we rolled it out as this new thing, that people would feel very initiative weary and overwhelmed. With our math department, they've been actually working for quite a while at sort of re-examining how math is taught. And so what they have done is embedded a growth mindset and principles of instructional strategies. And so the sort of foundation of it almost is sort of the math conversation, where kids are taught how to have a conversation about talking about how they're thinking about solving math problems and different approaches. They're encouraged to think creatively and make mistakes. And within this is a strong component of growth mindset, and also sort of an added benefit of social awareness and self-management. So, and then, finally, we've been really, as of the last year, we started the work as our entire TK report card was being retooled to add the 4 social emotional learning competencies and that to replace what was previously citizenship standards. So we worked last year on building a rubric for that and for teachers to rate their students, and also giving teachers suggested strategies to use in their classrooms to promote those competencies. So that was rolled out this year in the report card, and it was used for the first time for the first report card season in November, and we just got the results back on that. And we're collecting feedback from teachers about the usefulness of the rubric, and we've gotten and also what their professional development needs may be. One of the things that have come up is that our rubric needs to be a lot more specific, and we need to be providing more particular professional development about, around how to assess kids in these different kinds of skills, and really what these skills are. And then our next steps are, we want to be able to sort of figure out how to measure an efficacy of a given strategy that we're recommending that a teacher do. And so we're working so my department's working fairly closely with the research department in talking about this. And so we're really kind of at the beginning stages of this, but this is kind of the, we really sort of feel like this is kind of a key component of the work. And so I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Susan from Los Angeles. And then I know we're going to come back around and have a discussion.
So hi, in LA Unified, there are 6 social emotional learning facilitators. We're actually housed as part of the health education in the Division of Instruction. And I think being in the Division of Instruction is very helpful because it gives us access to talking to other folks in instruction about how they might be integrating SEL into their practice. This is the 2nd year of the program. We offered this program that we have in LA Unified to 100 schools, and 79 elected to participate. And through their participation, we gave them funding to have a team of teachers, 5 at the high school level, 4 at middle school, and 3 at elementary. And those teams are given data and asked to develop a plan to address specific needs, specific areas in social emotional learning where their school is having issues. And they're looking at it as in terms of the competencies, but they're also looking at it in terms of specific groups, specific subgroups where the competencies, where we see sort of shifts in the competencies. So we might see that the schools looks like it's doing fairly well in social awareness, but then if we disaggregate the data with the team, they might find that certain groups on their campus are not doing as well. And so we ask them to develop plans that specifically address those. As I said, we're 6 facilitators, and what we do is we go across our district and work with the teams on site as much as we can. We do pull them together a couple of times a year, and in pulling them together, we're asking them to look at their best practices and share them among their grade level alike groups. And that's about as much of an introduction as I need to give, I think.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think that I will hand it over now to Melissa, who will help moderate this discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Key and Susan, for those overviews. It's interesting to hear about kind of the different approaches your respective districts have taken in supporting the whole student. I just want to remind listeners that you can submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to kind of monitor those questions throughout. I want to start out with giving Susan and Key a chance to kind of elaborate on your introductions. As a group, as Bob mentioned, the core districts are primarily known for their innovative data dashboard and accountability model, which includes measures related to students' social and emotional growth. But Key and Susan, I'd like to give you the chance to talk a little bit more about the main steps or strategies that your specific districts are taking to support students' comprehensive development at the school and classroom levels. So in other words, what have been your primary levers in supporting the whole student?
Do you want to take it, Key?
Sure. Well, from where we are, we're in the Office of Pupil Services, and we're also part of the division that houses the social workers in school health. And so a lot of the work traditionally around supporting students, the whole student, has been in the province of school health and pupil services. And so it was sort of natural that we took the lead on it, and because we had been doing these kinds of initiatives before, you know, with respect to PBIS and restorative practices and having a social emotional learning curriculum. How we were actually measuring, you know, how that work was happening, we weren't necessarily doing it by individual students. We were really kind of looking more at things like suspension data, you know, academic progress, kind of very big buckets of data. So I think we have a real strong commitment to it. We don't necessarily have a strong unity of doing any one thing with a lot of fidelity, if that makes sense. And so one of our issues is because we have so many initiatives, I think schools feel a little overloaded by the choices that they have. So we're committed to it, and we're somewhat organized about it, but we're trying to organize it more so it's coherent for schools.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it's hard to bring everything together. We also work with school mental health, and we also are working with division that's rolled out restorative justice practices. But our approach through our team is to go through the classroom and to deal with it through instruction. So having that data that takes the core competencies and disaggregates them by group, and having a way to share that specifically with the teams of teachers that are on site so they can actually look at what's happening at their own school, has really brought all this together for LA Unified, because many of the teachers, when we had that first PD, said that that was some of the best information they had ever gotten, because they could look specifically at what was going on at their site and develop a plan based on their own data. And so we do have an implementation template, which I will share with Bob if he wants, that we ask the schools to fill out. But basically the template says, use your data as a starting point and develop some actions based upon that data, and tell us how you are going to measure them. We'll also have the outside measurement of the school experience survey, but we wanted to ask the schools what they felt would work for them, to sort of pull it together and to put it back into looking at it at the school site level.
So Susan, I'm curious. You said, I think 79 schools are participating in this. We had a question from a listener who's asking, what about the schools that aren't participating? Are they being used as some sort of control group when you evaluate effectiveness, or are there any plans to at some point bring them on board as well?
We're looking at bringing more schools on board, and it's a matter of funding. There's also some work that's being done with our Beyond the Bell division, our after school programs. And through that work, they're training their after school program facilitators to address social emotional learning. And so those are schools that are not necessarily core that are getting those interventions. So I don't think that we could really do a control group besides the Beyond the Bell. I think it's hard to do control groups with educators, because when things work, they share them with each other. So they may not be telling you that they're sharing it, and you may not know that these other kids are getting these interventions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really something that is within the parameters of real pure research, if you will.
I kind of want to drill down a little bit more, almost to the school and the classroom level. The commission, as I mentioned earlier, is focused on the full integration of social, emotional, and academic development in both teaching and learning, as well as school climate and culture. And one question we get a lot is, what does this look like? So I'm wondering if you could provide some tangible examples from your district about what this can look like in practice at the school and the classroom level. I know, Key, you mentioned your growth mindset math curriculum. That could be one example that you share a little bit more information about.
Yes, with that, it's really how math is taught to the kids in a very, in a way that encourages process over product, and also encourages kids having really a growth mindset, a mindset to learn and to explore and to challenge themselves. And so in order for that to happen, the environment has to be made very safe. And so the teacher has to spend a fair amount of time modeling, well, what does a safe environment look like? What are the norms that we're gonna have actually in our class in general, but if you're a K-5 teacher, but if you're a secondary teacher, what are the norms in math class? What are the norms that we're always going to have? And it's important that those norms are agreed upon by the kids so they can participate meaningfully. And then what's sort of the continuum of response from the teacher if those norms aren't abided by, so that already creates a very safe environment for the students. And so really kind of how much the teacher's affect is so key in this process. And then the next piece is that making sure that the activities that are being taught are taught in a way that there's more than one way to solve the problem, and that every way is sort of valued, and that if this, and the most important piece is that if the student is able to really articulate how he or she got there, and if other students are able to listen carefully and have a give and take about, well, okay, that sounds great, you got there that way, but you try thinking about it this way. So what we're teaching our students is not only math skills, but we're teaching them how to have a meaningful conversation and to challenge each other in a respectful way, and for the sort of common goal of solving a math problem, and for learning together. And so kind of embedded in this process are kind of really all the values and skills we want our kids to have. And it seems, in some ways, it seems very simple, but it's a very complicated stream of work that really involves, sort of not only sort of teachers, quote unquote, buy-in, but the skill, and also the commitment of the kids to do this. And that commitment really has to be modeled by the adults and by the schools. So it's a big sort of piece of work.
I have to say, I can't think of any examples of a math curriculum like that back in my K-12 experience, and I'm sure I would have benefited a lot from it.
Oh, come on down. And then I was also going to say with that, that we have, as an example of one of the strategies that we're using in the district is the PACS Good Behavior game, and that is built on several research-based kernels, all in the service of creating a safe and positive and consistent and predictable environment for the students, and also in the service of kids having agency over their behavior and their environment. I mean, that the idea is that the practices are kind of creating an environment in which kids want to take on leadership roles, they want to be kind to each other, they want to create a world in which everybody can succeed. And one of the key parts of that is kids writing each other praise notes, kind of, instead of tattling on each other, they will praise each other. And a lot of research has sort of shown that if you get kids to look for good behavior, they're going to stop tattling, right? Because kids tattle because they want attention. So if they're getting attention for calling out good behavior, that's already going to kind of create a very positive environment. And then in that kind of environment, learning can happen. Kids feel safe, they can take risks, they can ask for help, and they're kind of their sort of defensive affect is way down. The other piece sort of around, the simple act of writing praise notes is that enriches, your communication standards and writing standards. So those are a couple of sort of concrete examples of one of the strategies that we've been using in this district.
Thank you. I've been monitoring some of the questions coming in from our listeners, and there's some curiosity around the professional development that you're providing your educators to engage in some of these practices. So maybe we could start with Susan here. If you could tell us a little bit more about the support you're providing to school leaders and educators and helping them move to this more comprehensive approach.
Sure. So when we asked the schools to participate, they elected a team of teachers, and those teachers and out of classroom personnel came to one full day meeting where we gave them some basic information about social emotional learning, and then gave them some background on how to interpret the data, and then gave them access to their specific data. And then we gave them a couple of hours to work as a team to dig into their data, look at the implementation plan, and start to think about some specific questions they might have for us as groups about how to proceed. Then we brought them all back together as a group, and we address some of those questions in the whole group setting. We then follow up with, we are each assigned to specific schools as their facilitator. And the people at those schools can either email us, call us, and we also try to do site visits. We try to do a site visit at each school once every 2 weeks so that we can check in with one of the members of the team. The other thing, because LA Unified is so large, we do have 720 square miles to cover. I do high schools, and my high schools are all the way from San Pedro, which is way, way in the south, up to the very northeast corner of the valley. So we're knowing that we can't get to everybody to do everything. We've also developed an online platform. So we have through LA Unified something called MyPLN, where we can put up web-based professional development that the teachers can do when they want to do it on their own time. And we're able to use some of the funding to be able to pay those teachers at least a small stipend to do those trainings, those online trainings. We've got 2 up so far, SEL 101 and Growth Mindset, and the other competencies are going to be posted up by the end of January.
And I would just add one other thing here. We do on our website have free PD toolkits that are available to all, and I think that actually, having professional development that is accessible to a bunch of educators helps to, create a universal language around some of these things, and I think creates greater buy-in among a variety of educators at different levels that are participating. So I think it's really great to hear that from Susan.
And I would just like to go back to the specific strategies for one moment, if I might.
Sure.
For high school, which is my focus, we're interested in both instructional practices and curriculum. And I'm working with my high schools to work in a lot more student voice and student choice. And also working in some specific strategies. A lot of my former expertise is in service learning. So going back, even though that's an old tried and true strategy, looking at service learning strategies and how they incorporate social emotional learning, looking at youth-led evaluation and how that could work through mathematics, looking at youth participatory action research, and specifically talking to schools about how those strategies increase both self-efficacy and social awareness, so that the teachers can sort of pin it on something concrete, I think is pretty helpful for us.
Thank you. We have a question from a listener that's wondering, how are families and communities included in the development of these initiatives, or how are you communicating about these initiatives to them?
In our district, the initiative prior to CORE, all of that was part of initiatives that came through our school board, that we developed these, and that we've been communicating mostly through our school board around that and our website. And then with CORE, we communicated with families at any opportunity that there was for, say, kind of family day at the schools, and any sort of family oriented meetings that happen outside of the school, like so Families for Support with Kids with Disabilities might be one kind of group, and that we were going to those specific places to communicate what was going on with CORE. And then finally, when we were developing the report card, we did a family-facing guide to the report card, and that was workshopped quite a bit with a variety of different family groups before it went to publication.
I'm curious about whether you all have found that families and community members kind of readily grasp the idea of social and emotional learning. Bob mentioned the Tower of Babel with all the terms that are out there. The Commission uses the term SEAD. So I'm wondering, like, how easy it's been for your families and community members to understand the concept and what it means, and how you've really gone about communicating about this approach to learning, whether there have been specific terms or examples that have been really helpful for them?
I think one strategy that helps is we've asked our implementation teams to have a teacher from their team or another staff member to present at school site council or PTA or PTSA meetings. But I think what is almost more effective is asking a student to present and to put it, because they'll put it in language that is very specific to their community. And I would say the only pushback we get from some parents is on the growth mindset, because they were trained in a very different way, and they want, does that make sense to you, Keith, too? They want it to be, they don't want us to say, I'll learn it someday. They want their kids to learn it right now. And so there's a little pushback on that. We have to reframe it a couple of times before we get it accepted by some groups.
Well, and it makes sense for me because families are very concerned about a child's progress and a child's grade. And so sometimes it may sound as if we're saying, they'll learn it someday, don't worry about it. And it's okay, well, when is that day? And is that going to affect his grade? And especially at the high school level, when it really matters when you're looking down the road to college. And I think we've also encountered that a bit ourselves, and that people feel that because we had been in the past a district that seemed to be very product oriented, and to make this shift to something that's more process oriented, it's been a bit of a shift. I think we've been very intentional about using social and emotional learning skills, partly because we had social emotional learning curriculum, already kind of introduced to the district, and that we were sending home links around that. So I think our families understand that. And for the most part, and also being in San Francisco, our families have really embraced it, or have really appreciated that the schools are concerned with teaching skills around self-management and social awareness. Because I think in the past, oftentimes families felt like they were getting the message that that was their responsibility only, and that they had to send kids to school who had, had high rates of efficacy around social awearness and self-management.
And so, sorry, Melissa, one thing to say, we get a question often about, well, we're very, from districts or from state leaders saying, we're very interested in SEL or SEL measurement, but in our system, can you tell us where exactly to start? And I think that what Susan and Key have just said it really highlights the importance of getting buy-in from families very early on in the process, and listening to what families are interested in very early on the process, so that you can be able to integrate what their concerns are as you build, SEL, whether it's measurement or different kind of programming, into your system. And so I think it's really great to hear from that. And those comments I think are very well put.
I want to pivot a little bit to the topic of assessment and measurement. There's been some debate in the field about whether and how to measure social and emotional growth. And Bob, you already touched on some compelling reasons for measurement, but I'm wondering what you've learned since the work in the core districts has begun about how best to measure these skills, and whether there are plans down the road to move beyond the self-report and teacher observation surveys to other tools such as performance measures. Great question, Melissa. So one thing I'll say, and this relates to the 2015 field test, but in general, there's been very encouraging, and it's not conclusive, but it's just encouraging evidence so far about validity and predictability of student self-reports and teacher self-reports. However, a drawback or a limitation that we have right now is something that we don't know, is we really don't know how these kinds of measurements would behave under a quote unquote high stakes system or an accountability system. We don't really have anything to go off of on that yet. And I say that because there's a concern among researchers that,
having, say, student self-reports or teacher reports of students in a system in which you could be penalized could lead to faking or gaming. And those are legitimate concerns that researchers are looking for. Now, I will say that we did not find any instances, the research did not produce any instances of that in the field test in 2015, but it is something that going forward, the field is going to be concerned about, and researchers, whether it's at Harvard or at Pace in California, I know that they're looking into this. They want to be very thoughtful and critical of that. The other concern is something called reference bias, and that's really just a way of saying that researchers talk about this when we talk about, it's actually a problem in any kind of, or most kinds of self-reports, but answering questions based on your own context. So like your own understanding of self-management as a student is based on how others around you defined self-management. And that definition, or the importance that's placed on that definition, could change from school to school, right? So that's another thing that we are concerned about in terms of student self-reports and teacher reports. Again, I will say we did not find evidence of reference bias in that field test that I mentioned, but I think it's definitely something that we're going to have to continue to study to know whether ultimately these are the best kinds of measures for kids. In terms of your other question about whether going forward, whether there might be a shift from, say, the student self-reports to like performance-based assessments, which for those of you out there that are not as familiar with this, there's performance-based assessments are the best example of this is the marshmallow test that you might have heard of, where in the 60s, Stanford researchers tested students' willingness to say no to eating a marshmallow immediately, knowing that in the future they'd get two. And so what I can say about this is that, that's a pretty nascent study going on there. Like, we don't know enough yet about performance-based measures. And what I would say is that, I can only speak for us as an organization, but we are very pragmatic in the sense that we want to do what works and not do what doesn't work. And so there's a lot of concerns right now, and I think very valid ones, about whether the questions or the measures in these assessments are, whether they're fair, whether they're culturally biased, whether they are not accurate. I mean, there's a lot of concerns. And what I would say is, I think the best answer to this is to keep measuring them to figure out what works and what doesn't. And I will say that, that is a key element of CORE's partnership with PACE, an organization in California, the Policy Advocacy for California Education. It's based in Stanford. And they are pulling apart the data now to help figure this out and try to figure out what are the best measures. And so a more succinct way of answering this, Melissa, is that we don't know yet, but I think that if we keep like analyzing this data and aggregating this data, we'll learn more. And I would also say that one thing that I think is a concern among a lot of, I see that we're running out of time here, but a big concern I think among a lot of states and districts is, well, is this lead to data saturation or data overload? And I think a big way to overcome this is really pulling apart data to try to find specific trends and then focusing on those trends. And I think that can help to overcome that saturation.
And Melissa, very, very quickly, I'm a 30-year classroom teacher, but I'm also a researcher. And what I'm working on with LA Unified is trying to get some really good qualitative data.
Yep.
So taking the students at the specific sites, and we're doing focus groups with teachers and focus groups with students. And I'm also working with one of our arts people who's doing a social emotional learning dance festival this spring. And one of the components of the dance festival is all of the dancers are keeping a sort of social emotional learning journal with reflective questions that we're going to get to see at the end. And so I think looking at it in terms of the possibility of gathering qualitative measures as well is important.
Yep.
Thank you both for shedding some insight on that topic. I'm looking at the clock. We're kind of winding down. So I'm wondering if we could almost do a rapid fire round of having you all respond to kind of two final questions as succinctly as possible. What's been your district's biggest obstacle in supporting the whole student, and how are you working to overcome it? And then finally, what advice would you give to a district just starting out? So I'll I'll maybe pass it over to, I don't know, Susan Key.
Okay, so our biggest issue, I think, might be something that Key referenced earlier, and that's initiative saturation. People are just, there's so many things coming at them. We have to make sure that this is integrated and not layered on top of.
Right.
And I would also say that where the state and the government is going with measurement is going to determine how much attention it gets. If they actually keep measuring social emotional learning and it becomes part of the accountability model, they're asking us lots of questions about that. You know, are we going to get in trouble if we don't do it? Which is kind of sad, but that's part of our reality.
Right.
I concur with Susan, and I think also for us is that we, like probably a lot of other districts, we can be a bit siloed, and so we just centrally really have to communicate with everybody and make sure that we're completely aligned and that what we're going to be doing is going to be, we're not going to be doing too much, but we'll be doing just enough and making the right decisions about what that is.
And I'll answer your second question, Melissa, as I see you're running up. But I think there's two things, I think, when it comes to advice about starting out on this. I think there's a saying, go slow to go fast. I think I have that right. Where I think it comes back to that question we thought about before of like getting buy-in, really taking the time to get genuine, like authentic, I think, you know, authentic feedback from parents, families, you know, teachers, other people on staff, so that you have kind of a unified communication network. And I think that leads to a second point about making sure that however the data is aggregated and then analyzed, that it's communicated out in a way that is digestible for teachers and for families, so that people have a really good sense of how this is being used, and that it's not being used to punish students or to punish schools. It's being used to try to target support and really get resources or supports or interventions to students who need it most. And I think that that messaging is really, really important. And I think it starts at the beginning.
Yeah, and my last thought would be, for school districts starting out, don't try a one-size-fits-all model.
Yep.
I mean, it sort of goes against the grain of what social emotional learning is anyway. But I think some people want to try to turn it into a program and say, you're all going to do this. And so I really think that never works, because all that does is make a teacher say, no, I'm not. So.
I completely agree. And also I think that the training, the coaching, the professional development must be continuous. And districts have to make pretty much an eternal commitment to doing it, because it's nothing that you can do, you can think you can do in 3 years and then everybody's all learned up. Given the high rates of turnover we have in our districts and everything else going on, that it has to be a continuous sustained effort.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Bob, Susan, Key, for your thoughts. I feel like we barely scratched the surface today, but hopefully provided people with at least an initial sense of some of the work that your districts are doing underneath the overarching work of the Core Districts Initiative. And I'll maybe pass it over to Bob for any kind of housekeeping notes.
Yes, we're over 4 o'clock, so I'll just be very quick. Thank you again to everybody. If you would like to access these slides, please feel free to email me at bob@transformingeducation.org. And thank you so much for attending this. We will have more webinars in the future. As I think I agree with Melissa, we just scratched the surface. And I think we look forward to more of these conversations in the future. So I hope everybody has a great day and a great almost weekend. We're almost there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.